So the question now that Napoleon had to answer was what to do next. This question was to some degree answered for him by the arrival of the Prussians at Plancenoit. They had managed by this time to march across the road and effect a juncture with Wellington. They weren't there yet, but they were getting there. They accordingly, taking advantage of the fact that they were coming in on the French flank, launched some forces to attack and try to take Plancenoit in the French rear. Napoleon realized that this was a very, very serious danger. If the Prussians had a force in his rear, they could effectively work on attacking him from behind, which would then result in his army getting virtually smashed between the two Allied armies. So, Napoleon, to counter this threat, deployed two forces from the Young Guard to defend Plancenoit. So, here is the setup. You can see the Prussians starting to take Plancenoit here, and the two battalions of the Young Guard here holding it. And in the meantime, Napoleon still did not have a new plan for beating Wellington. However, Ney did have a plan. No one is exactly sure what happened at this point, but we have some good guesses. At this point, Wellington withdrew all of his wounded and prisoners straight north along this road up to Waterloo to get them out of the way because there was a temporary lull in the fighting. Ney was about here doing a personal reconnaissance along the front when he saw these troops retreating. He then mistook them for Wellington's whole army retreating north and withdrawing from their position. Since he happened to command all the reserve cavalry, he ordered them all to concentrate at a point here. He did not anticipate leading them in an attack at this point, but he thought that if Wellington was really retreating, that then he could launch the cavalry forward and harass them on their retreat. Wellington, observing this concentration of cavalry, determined that Ney was going to be launching, or rather Napoleon was going to be launching, a massive cavalry attack at him. So he pulled his entire army, with the exceptions, of course, of the defenders of Hougoumont, La Haye-Saint, Papelotte, and La Haye, straight up behind the ridge, and had them all deploy in square formation. Now, for those of you who don't know, square formation was a tactic which was used back then to combat cavalry. It involved a force, as you can see here in this picture, a force of men deploying roughly into the shape of a square with bayonets facing outwards. The idea is that a horse will never, ever charge anything that is as sharp-pointed and inaccessible as the hedge of bayonets that the square forms. The biggest enemy of the square is the artillery. Because so many men are concentrated in so small an area, any shot that lands there is going to produce horrible casualties. So, when Wellington pulled his army up behind the ridge, it pulled them to safety. The French artillery couldn't see them, they couldn't bombard them because they were hidden behind the ridge. So this was the situation. Wellington's men are behind the ridge in squares, and Ney's cavalry is concentrated like this. Ney mistook Wellington's pulling behind the ridge for the whole army's withdrawal straight north. Accordingly, without any permission from Napoleon, he determined to lead all of his cavalry in a charge of the British lines. Naturally, this charge was a big disaster. Not a single British square broke before the French cavalry. Hundreds of thousands of French troopers died in this valiant but futile attempt, and it was a fiasco for the French, a complete and total loss. However, although it was a complete and total loss, Napoleon realized that it did have one beneficial outcome, which was that it weakened Wellington's army. It severely weakened Wellington to the point that Wellington had to move most of his reserves up, and Wellington didn't have enough gunners anymore to man many of his cannons. So Napoleon now determined that he would take advantage of this new weakness to try again on his center assault. Only the target wouldn't be the center so much as it would be to attack La Haye Sainte. If he could take La Haye Sainte, then the French occupying it would be able to support any attack that would advance up from that point. Accordingly, the task fell to the remnants of d'Erlon's force, which had originally launched the first attack on the center. This attack, however, met with much greater success, because the defenders of La Haye Sainte, which were the King's German Legion, by the way, had run out of ammunition. They fought valiantly, they fought bravely, but in the end they were forced to retire just because they didn't have enough stuff to fight with. So the French ended up taking La Haye Sainte. At this point, it seemed like the French were winning. In the meantime, by the way, the Prussians' attack on Plancenoit was turning out very well. Napoleon was having to concentrate many of his resources to holding the Prussians off. But as of right now, the big question that concerned Napoleon was, how could he break Wellington quickly before the Prussians could arrive entirely in force? The answer for him was to launch the Imperial Guard. The Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard, otherwise known as the Old Guard, were his elite force. They had never been broken in battle. They were deemed by many to be invincible. They had fought in battles all over Europe. They were the best of the French army. They had always been called upon by Napoleon whenever there was dire straits that needed a breakthrough quickly, whenever it was a hard fight and needed something to be resolved quickly, and the Old Guard had always carried through. So Napoleon called upon three divisions of the Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard to attack Wellington Center in one final attempt to break it. The Grenadiers of the Imperial Guard advanced the length of the field in massed column, personally led by Napoleon for part of the way, and Marshal Ney took over for the rest of the way when it started getting dangerous. And in the end, when they arrived at the ridge, it became one of the most epic parts of the Battle of Waterloo. The columns faced the British lines. The British, although weakened, had still every expectancy of victory, and when the Duke of Wellington saw the columns of the Old Guard advancing, he personally took his hat and waved it for the men to stand up and fire in volley after volley into the Old Guard. They completely cut them to pieces. They drove the Old Guard to flight for the first time in history, and with them, the French army collapsed in total retreat. The Prussians broke through Plancenoit, finally pushing and arriving in force to overwhelm Napoleon's right flank. The defenders of Hougoumont withdrew from the position and began an attack on Napoleon's left, which, seeing the results of the Old Guard, their morale completely plummeted, so they had no fight in them, so they up and ran, and Napoleon's dream came to a complete and total end. So in the end, from the broad scope, here's how the Battle of Waterloo looked. The Prussians made it along this road, effected a junction with Wellington, and the two continued driving Napoleon down to the south. In the meantime, Grouchy, who could have done a lot of good if he had arrived to intercept the Prussians, in fact had been held up at Wavre by General Graf von Zieten, who his corps had been left behind by von Blücher to hold Wavre and delay him. And the delay was a complete success. The Prussians arrived in time, and that was the end of Waterloo. If you're interested in learning more about the Battle of Waterloo, I highly recommend the following sources. I used all of these to come up with the visual aids and the information involved in this speech. I hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope that you'll look into some of these resources. They're all very good, they're all easy to come by, and I really hope that you enjoyed this speech. I hope you learned a lot, and I thank you very much for your time.